Welcome. Close your eyes when you're ready and let the stillness settle over you. Far from the day, we'll drift toward the hushed mystery of a lost and golden room. If you find rest here, subscribe, and a new one will be ready each night. In a workshop on the outskirts of Berlin, in the early weeks of 1701, a craftsman held a piece of amber in his palm and felt it grow warm. This is where the story begins. Not with a king's ambition, not with a palace or a political treaty, but with this single object, small enough to close a fist around, its surface slightly tacky from the cut, its interior the color of darkened honey, lit from within by something that was not quite light. The amber had been collected from the Baltic coast, transported inland by cart, sorted by hand, and set aside because its particular shade and clarity made it suitable for work that required the finest available pieces. And now it rested in a craftsman's palm in a cold room in winter, and despite the cold it was warm, the way amber always is, warmer than stone, warmer than glass, warmer than almost any mineral that has ever been pulled from the earth. That warmth is a property of amber's composition. It is a poor conductor of heat, which means it does not draw warmth away from skin on contact, and so it registers as warm even when it is not. The craftsmen who worked with it every day would have known this. They would have known it the way any skilled person knows the specific properties of the material they have spent years working, not as a fact to be stated, but as a sensation so familiar it has become unremarkable. And yet it remained, despite familiarity, a beautiful material to hold. 44 million years of compression and geological transformation, and the result was this, a piece of fossilized pine resin that glowed from inside like a lamp with no source and felt alive in the hand. The workshop was in the service buildings of the Berlin Palace. The year was 1701, and the commission that had brought amber into this workspace was new, formally entered into the court records of Friedrich I, who had just been crowned the first king of Prussia, and who required, with some urgency, a space that would adequately express what it meant to be the first of anything. Friedrich I had come to kingship through a negotiation rather than inheritance in the traditional sense. The Hohenzollern electors of Brandenburg had governed their territories for generations under the Holy Roman Empire, and the elevation of that territory to a kingdom with its attendant status, its formal recognition by the European powers, its implication that the Hohenzollern line belonged among the crowned heads of the continent, required a physical expression as well as a political one. Palaces were how kingdoms declared themselves. Rooms within palaces were how kingdoms declared their interior life, and the interior life that Friedrich I wished to declare was one of unambiguous, costly, unprecedented beauty. Andreas Schluter was the man commissioned to design it. Schluter was a sculptor and architect of the Baroque period, trained in the visual language of weight and ornament and the studied overflow of decorative detail that Baroque interiors demanded from every surface. He had designed the Berlin Palace's external facades. He understood how buildings spoke, and when the commission for an amber-paneled chamber arrived, a room whose walls would be constructed not from stone or plaster or imported marble, but from amber, from the semi-precious fossilized resin of the Baltic coast, he understood both the ambition and the specific challenge it presented. Amber is not a conventional building material. It does not cut cleanly. It does not take pressure evenly. It is brittle in ways that marble is not, prone to cracking along stress lines that are not always visible on the surface, and its color varies so widely, from the pale yellow of mid-morning light to the deep cognac of aged whiskey. with occasional pieces that shade toward a transparent blue-green, so rare that craftsmen might work an entire year without encountering one, that matching panels for a large-scale decorative scheme required the accumulation of material on a scale that made the project immediately complicated. Schluter knew the material. He knew that a room paneled in amber would be unlike any other room in Europe. He would have known also that making it would require not just design, but access to amber in quantities that almost no one had ever assembled in one place. The amber came from the Samland Peninsula. The Samland is a small finger of land on the Baltic coast in the territory that is now the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. For centuries, for millennia, if one includes the prehistoric trade networks that moved Baltic amber along rivers and overland routes to Rome and to Egypt, this coastline had been the source of most of the amber that reached the craftsmen and collectors and courts of Europe. The Baltic seabed held amber in quantities unmatched anywhere else in the world, and the Samland coast, where the geological conditions concentrated the deposits near the surface, produced amber in volumes that had made the region historically famous. Storms pushed amber onto the beaches. Fishermen dragged it up in their nets. Divers collected it from shallow waters. And the deposits inland, once the surface layers were understood, ran deep enough to supply workshops for generations. The pieces that washed up ranged from fragments the size of a thumbnail to lumps the weight of a fist. Some were nearly clear, their interiors visible through a glassy translucency. Some were opaque, their surfaces weathered to a frosted crust by decades of water and sand. Some held inclusions, small insects, fragments of ancient plant matter, air bubbles trapped at the moment of fossilization 44 million years ago that made each piece a specific and unrepeatable object. Craftsmen who worked amber for decorative purposes learned to read these qualities. They sorted by color, by translucency, by weight, by the shape that would emerge once the outer weathering crust was cut away and the inner material was exposed. For the amber panels destined for the Berlin Palace, the raw material was gathered, sorted, and transported inland by a supply chain that had been in operation for years before Schluter received the commission. The Amber Guild of the Baltic coast was an old institution, trained in the traditions of amber working that had developed over centuries of specialization, and from within that tradition, Schluter had access to one of its most accomplished practitioners. Gottfried Wolfram was Danish by origin and trained in the Amber Guild methods of the Baltic coast. He was described in the documents of the period as a specialist, a craftsman, whose particular skills lay in the construction of precisely fitted decorative amber panels, a technique that required the ability to cut irregular natural pieces into tiles of consistent dimension without cracking them, to grade and match those tiles by color and translucency, and to fit them onto a wooden backing frame in a sequence that created a coherent visual field from hundreds of individual fragments. This was work that required patience measured not in hours but in years, and skill measured not in the broad strokes of design, but in the tolerance of very small gaps and very precise fits. Wolfram began work on the amber panels around 1701, following the commission from Friedrich I. The workspace would have been a long bench or series of benches in a palace outbuilding, a practical, unglamorous room that was the actual site of the production that would eventually be installed in a grand state chamber. On those benches, amber pieces in every shade from pale yellow to deep cognac were laid out in rough groupings by color and translucency, waiting to be fitted. A wooden backing frame, flat on the table, its surface prepared to receive the amber tiles, was where the actual construction happened. Each tile was placed in sequence, fitted against its neighbors, backed with foil that amplified the amber's natural glow by reflecting light back through the stone from behind and secured. The foil backing is a detail that matters more than it first seems. Amber is translucent in ways that most decorative stones are not, and the effect of a large amber panel depends on the way light moves through and within the material, rather than simply reflecting from its surface. A foil backing, fine metal leaf placed beneath each amber tile before it was set meant that light entering the amber from the front would travel into the material, reach the reflective foil beneath, and return back through the amber in a way that gave the panels an appearance of depth, of internal illumination, of a warmth that seemed to emanate from within the stone rather than from any external source. This was not an accidental discovery. It is a technique developed within the amber working tradition and applied here with specific knowledge of the effect it would produce in a large-scale decorative installation. Wolfram worked on the panels for approximately 6 years. The records of the period suggest he was skilled enough at the work and sufficiently trusted by the court that he remained in charge of the project through its early phase without significant dispute. Then, around 1707, something changed. The precise nature of the falling out between Wolfram and the Prussian court is not entirely clear from the surviving records. A disagreement over payment, over the pace of work, over some aspect of the design or the execution that one party considered unsatisfactory. What the records show is that by approximately 1707, Wolfram was no longer working on the panels, and two German craftsmen, Ernst Schacht and Gottfried Thorau, had taken over the work. Schacht and Thorau continued where Wolfram had left them. They were working in the same techniques with the same materials toward the same design, amber tiles backed with foil, fitted onto wooden frames, arranged into the decorative scheme that Schluter had specified. The transition between craftsmen, whatever its personal and financial complications, did not fundamentally alter the character of what was being made. The panels continued to accumulate, the amber continued to be sorted and cut and fitted. The workshop benches continued to hold, at the end of each working day, the partially completed evidence of a project that had no fixed end date and no clearly agreed delivery timeline. Friedrich I did not live to see the room installed. He died in 1713, 12 years after commissioning the work and 6 years after the change in craftsmen, at a point when the amber panels were still in an incomplete state that no one had formally assessed. The project was suspended. The panels were moved into storage, crates in a room somewhere in the Berlin Palace complex, stacked carefully against the wall, their contents wrapped or padded against the risk of cracking, their exact inventory unclear, even to the palace officials responsible for managing the collection. The craftsmen who had made them were paid off or dismissed, or simply no longer engaged. The room that was supposed to hold them remained an ordinary room in the Berlin Palace, and the amber panels rested in the dark, unknown to most of the palace's inhabitants, in conditions that no one had particularly planned. The king who inherited this situation was Friedrich Wilhelm I, and he was not Friedrich I. Where Friedrich I had wanted prestige, the visible, decorated, amber-paneled declaration of a kingdom's cultural ambition, Friedrich Wilhelm I wanted efficiency. His instincts were military rather than aesthetic. He maintained a regiment of very tall soldiers, recruited from across Europe, with a specific preference for men of exceptional height, because tall soldiers were a point of personal pride for him that operated somewhere between military discipline and elaborate private obsession. He drilled his troops. He managed his court's finances with a tightness that his father would have found uncomfortable. He looked at the crates of amber panels stored in the Berlin Palace and saw not a great artistic project requiring completion, but an expensive and inconvenient inheritance that he had no particular use for. The panels waited. What it means for something to wait in storage in a palace is not straightforward. These were not small objects. The amber pieces had been collected, transported, sorted, cut, backed with foil, and assembled into panel sections that represented years of skilled labor and a supply of raw material drawn from one of the most historically rich deposits in the world. Each tile was a specific decision. This color here, this translucency there, this slightly irregular edge fitted against its neighbor with a tolerance measured in millimeters. The knowledge of what the panels were and what they would become if they were ever assembled and installed was concentrated in the few craftsmen who had worked on them, and those craftsmen were no longer employed on the project. So the amber sat in its crates in a quiet room, and the room's windows let in the particular light of the Berlin winters, flat and pale and persistent, and the amber inside the crates did not see any of it, being buried under padding and wooden slats and the general administrative inattention of a court that had moved on to other priorities. In the project that Friedrich the Feared had set in motion with a formal commission entered into the court record books, the large bound volumes of administrative entries, the word Bernstein appearing near the top of a paragraph that had authorized something no one had yet resolved, entered a phase of suspension that no one had planned and no one had formally declared. These things happen with ambitious projects. The craftsmen who began them are replaced. The kings who ordered them die. The rooms that were supposed to hold them remain empty, while the materials wait in their crates for someone to decide what to do with them. The amber panels for the Berlin Palace Chamber spent years in that condition, complete enough to be valuable, incomplete enough to be unresolved, significant enough that no one could simply discard them, inconvenient enough that no one quite knew what to do with them next. It is worth paying attention to what the crates actually contained, even in the abstract, to understand what the suspension of the project meant in material terms. The Samland Peninsula had yielded its amber over decades of collection and sorting. Wolfram had spent 6 years working on the panels before being replaced. Schacht and Turau had continued the work for years after that. The foil backing had been applied, the wooden frames had been constructed, the tiles had been cut and fitted with the specific skill of craftsmen who had trained for years in these techniques. All of that accumulated labor and material and knowledge was now sitting in a cool, dim storage room in a palace in Berlin, waiting for someone to decide that it mattered. In the storeroom, the crates were arranged against one wall, their surfaces marked in some fashion, chalk notation, paper label, whatever the palace's administrative system used to track the contents of storage rooms, with information about what they contained and when they had been moved there. The amber inside them was stable in conditions that were reasonably cool and dry. Amber is a durable material in the right conditions. It had survived 44 million years in the earth, and it could survive a decade or two in a storeroom without significant deterioration, as long as the temperature remained consistent and the humidity did not fluctuate too severely. What it could not survive in any meaningful sense was being forgotten, not permanently forgotten. The court records contained the commission. The palace inventories listed the storage room's contents. The craftsmen who had worked on the panels were still living, in some cases, and would have been able to describe the work and its current state if asked, but there was a particular quality to the kind of forgetting that comes when a project loses its champion and its purpose simultaneously, when the person who ordered it is dead and the person who inherited it has no interest in it. That is different from the kind of forgetting that comes from a loss of records or a destruction of evidence. The amber panels were not lost. They were simply occupying the particular suspended state of a thing that exists and is documented and is known about and has no one at this particular moment Who cares what happens to it? There is something calm about this suspension, considered from a distance of 3 centuries. An extraordinary thing had been made, or partially made, from one of the most remarkable materials on the Baltic coast, by craftsmen who had dedicated years of their working lives to mastering the specific techniques the material required. And now it sat in its crates. The craftsmen went home. The storage room held its quiet. The palace above it continued with the business of a court, the drills and the accounts, and the regiment of tall soldiers, and all the other concerns of a king who had different priorities than his father had held. The amber panels for an uninstalled royal chamber in the Berlin Palace occupied the specific and untroubled condition of something that has been made and not yet used, waiting in the dark for a moment that has not arrived, entirely unaware, as objects are unaware of things, of how long that waiting might last, or what form the eventual resolution might take. In one of the large administrative ledgers of the Prussian court, the kind of bound volume that was filled out in careful German script and stored in the palace offices for reference, the original commission from Friedrich I was still legible. The word Bernstein appeared near the top of a paragraph, followed by the formal language of a royal commission, the authorization, the craftsman, the intended location, the general scope of the project. The ledger sat in its place on the shelf, its pages undisturbed. Below the Bernstein paragraph, other commissions and other administrative entries continued down the page, each one representing some other project or expense or decision that the court had authorized and then managed toward completion or abandonment. The Amber Commission was different from most of the entries on that page, only in that its resolution was still, after more than a decade, entirely pending. The ledger recorded a commission. The storeroom held the crates. Between the two, in the space where the record of completion should have been, there was only the quiet of a project suspended, not abandoned, not forgotten, not resolved, but waiting in the specific and patient way that very expensive and very unusual objects wait when the human beings who are supposed to decide their fate have either died or moved on to other concerns. The workshops where Wolfram and Schacht and Thurau had worked were cold in the Berlin winters and warmer in the summers, and always smelled faintly of the resinous quality that amber releases when it is worked. A faint, ancient smell, something between pine and earth, the product of a material that was millions of years old, being cut and shaped by craftsmen who had perhaps 3 or 4 decades of working life ahead of them. The benches where the amber tiles had been laid out and fitted and checked against one another were now empty, or occupied by other work, or covered in the general disorder of a workspace no longer organized around a single sustained project. Wolfram was somewhere in the Baltic coast region, perhaps, or in Denmark, where he had been trained. Schacht and Thurau were in their homes, their skills intact, their knowledge of the panels complete and specific and currently unneeded. The amber itself, the 44-million-year-old Baltic resin, collected from the beaches of the Samland Peninsula and cut by skilled hands into tiles of varying color and translucency, was in its crates in the storeroom, neither advancing nor retreating, simply present. The candles in the storeroom were not lit. There was no reason to light them. The crates did not require light. The amber inside them, with its foil backing and its carefully graded colors, was designed to glow under candlelight in a great paneled chamber with windows on 2 sides. In the storeroom, in the dark, it did not glow. It waited. The specific patience of this image is worth dwelling in for a moment. Something made to be luminous, resting in the dark. Something designed for the particular play of candlelight through amber panels and the amplification of that glow by foil backing, and the further multiplication of it by mirrors. All of that potential for light and color, and the strange internal warmth that amber produces when it is properly illuminated, compressed into crates in a storage room in a palace where no one was currently thinking about it. This is how extraordinary things sometimes begin their long life in the world, not with the moment of their completion, not with the ceremonial installation and the court's admiration and the foreign visitor's account of standing in a room that seemed almost impossibly beautiful, but with this earlier moment, the crates, the dark storeroom, the administrative ledger with its pending commission, the amber tiles sitting in their wooden backing frames, waiting for a fate that their maker never lived to arrange. Friedrich I had ordered the room because he wanted a declaration, something that said, in the material language of the court, that his newly established kingdom had arrived at a level of cultural ambition that the other crowned heads of Europe would recognize and acknowledge. He had found his architect in Schluter, his craftsman in Wolfram, his material in the Samland deposits, his technique in the foil-backed amber tile method that the Baltic Guild tradition had developed over generations. He had spent money and time and the administrative energy of his court on something that by any reasonable assessment was going to be extraordinary. And then he died, and the crates sat in the storeroom. There is no particular melancholy in this, considered calmly. It is simply the way things sometimes go, the gap between a commission and its completion, the suspended state of a project waiting for the right moment, the dark room holding something that was made to exist in light. The amber in the crates had been warm in the craftsman's palm in the workshop in 1701, and it would be warm again in someone's hand when the crates were eventually opened, and the question of what to do with the panels was eventually resolved. It just was not yet clear, in 1713, whose hand that would be, or when, or where the room that finally held them would stand. The storeroom was quiet. The palace above it continued with its business. The amber waited in its crates with the patient, untroubled quality of something that has been made from material that has already waited 44 million years and can manage, without difficulty, to wait a little longer. In a formal chamber of the Prussian court in the winter of 1716, two men sat across a table from one another with an unusual piece of paper between them. It was an inventory. The document listed, in careful administrative prose, the contents of 18 large wooden crates that had been in storage for several years. Crates filled with amber panels, carved and fitted, and foil-backed and waiting, representing more than a decade of skilled labor and a commission that had outlived the king who made it. Friedrich Wilhelm, the First of Prussia, pushed the inventory across the table toward Tsar Peter the Great of Russia, and what passed between them in that exchange was not simply a gift, but a calculation, the kind of transaction that empires conducted when they needed something from one another and had run out of subtler currencies. The gift was the amber room. The return was 55 unusually tall soldiers for Friedrich Wilhelm's famous regiment of giants, along with a lathe and a goblet that Peter had crafted himself. The soldiers were tall men recruited from across Russia, each one measuring above 6 feet, assembled because Friedrich Wilhelm collected them with the focused devotion that other rulers reserved for paintings or porcelain. And the lathe and goblet were Peter's own handiwork, a Tsar who turned wood and metal himself as a kind of private meditation, who took pride in making things with his hands in a way that most monarchs would have found undignified. What Friedrich Wilhelm received then was both a physical collection and a gesture of personal intimacy, a thing made by another ruler's hands, offered alongside men whose only distinction was their height. What Peter received was something considerably harder to describe. He received in 18 crates of uncertain completeness, the most extraordinary decorative material assembled anywhere in Europe in that century, and he placed it into storage in St. Petersburg with the calm confidence of a man who intended, eventually, to do something remarkable with it. The 18 crates made the journey from Berlin to St. Petersburg overland, carried by horse-drawn wagon along the roads of early 18th century northern Europe, roads that were rough in good weather and nearly impassable in the seasonal conditions of a Baltic winter. Special handling instructions had been prepared for the transport because the amber panels inside were irreplaceable and brittle and had already been moved once before from the workshops where they were made to the palace storeroom where they had sat for several years. Amber is not glass, but it shares glass's indifference to impact. A piece dropped from a height does not bend, it fractures, or it does not fracture, and there is no way to know in advance which it will do. The craftsmen who had worked with it for years understood this intuitively. They handled it with a particular quality of attention, the unhurried focus that very fragile and very valuable things demand. The wagoners transporting the crates understood only that the cargo was important and that they would be held responsible for its arrival. The amber traveled between these two registers of knowledge, wrapped in cloth and straw, jolting through the winter landscape at the pace of a walking horse, each mile adding to the improbable distance it had already traveled in its long history. Peter the Great died in 1725 without having done anything particular with the amber panels. They remained in storage, as they had in Berlin, as they had in the Prussian palace workshops. Before that, a project continually deferred, continually awaiting the moment when someone with sufficient attention and resources would decide what to do with it. Peter's death left the Russian imperial court in a period of succession, complications, and factional instability that occupied the energy of everyone who might otherwise have turned their attention to decorative projects of this kind. The amber waited, crated, in a St. Petersburg storage facility through the reigns of Catherine I and Peter II and Anna and even the Sixth, each transition bringing new priorities and new preoccupations that were not the amber room. This is one of the stranger qualities of the room's history, the long intervals of dormancy, the periods when something astonishing simply sat in boxes while the world moved around it, waiting for a moment of recognition that had not yet arrived. The moment arrived in a significant way with Empress Elizabeth. Elizabeth was Peter the Great's daughter, and she had inherited, among other things, her father's appetite for the grand and the visually overwhelming. She came to power in 1741 and moved quickly to make the Russian imperial court one of the most visually magnificent in Europe, an ambition that expressed itself most completely in her patronage of the architect Bartolomeo Francesco Rastrelli, who became the dominant figure of Russian Baroque design and the man most responsible for giving the court's physical world its particular character of gilded, layered, almost excessive beauty. Rastrelli had been born in Paris to a Florentine father, had grown up partly in Russia, and had developed a sensibility that combined Italian Baroque training with a Russian appetite for scale and ornament that produced something distinctive enough to be recognized as its own thing. The Winter Palace was his, the Smolny Convent was his, and when Elizabeth decided that the Amber Room would be installed permanently, magnificently, in the Catherine Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, it was Rastrelli she tasked with making it happen. The Catherine Palace stood 25 kilometers south of St. Petersburg in the parklands of Tsarskoye Selo, a name that translates, with a kind of self-evident imperial confidence, as Tsar's village. The palace had been built for Peter the Great's second wife, Catherine I, as a summer residence, and Elizabeth had inherited it along with everything else and had immediately found it too small. Rastrelli had been set to work expanding it into something enormous, a building whose main facade stretched more than 300 meters, painted in a particular shade of blue and white, with gold leaf trim along its decorative details, so that on a summer afternoon, seen from across the formal gardens, it appeared to be something assembled from sky and winter and fire in approximately equal measure. The state floor contained a sequence of ceremonial halls designed to move visitors from one register of magnificence to another, each room calibrated to produce a specific impression, the whole sequence building toward whatever room happened to be its centerpiece at a given moment in the palace's history. For the period of Elizabeth's reign, and for the century and a half that followed, the centerpiece was the Amber Room. The problem Rastrelli faced was one of proportion. The amber panels that had been made in the Prussian workshops at the beginning of the century had been designed for a specific room in a specific palace, a room with particular dimensions that had been measured and accounted for in every decision Gottfried Wolfram and his successors had made about scale and spacing and the relationship of each tier to the next. The hall designated for the room in the Catherine Palace was larger, not slightly larger in a way that could be managed by adjusting spacing or adding a few pieces, but substantially larger, a space with different proportions, different ceiling height, different wall lengths, the kind of difference that required not modification, but reinvention. Rastrelli resolved this by designing additional amber sections and supporting decorative elements to fill the space the original panels could not cover. This meant sourcing new amber, finding craftsmen capable of working in the established aesthetic of the original panels, and creating something that would read as continuous, even though it was, in a technical sense, composite, the original Prussian work, supplemented and extended by material created specifically for this room in this palace, the whole unified by Rastrelli's governing eye. The installation process took years. Amber is not a material that tolerates hurry. Each piece had to be examined, selected, cut if necessary, backed with foil to stabilize it and amplify its reflective qualities, and fitted into its designated position in the wooden frame that structured each wall section. The foil backing was particularly important. The craftsmen used gold and silver foil beneath the amber pieces, so that light passing through the translucent sections would be caught and returned, the amber glowing from its interior rather than merely from its surface. Against a plain backing, an amber panel is beautiful. Against a foil backing, under candlelight, it becomes something closer to a light source itself, the glow distributed through the material in a way that makes the stone appear warm, not as a metaphor, but as a physical sensation, the kind of warmth that a viewer in a candlelit room would register before they had fully processed what they were looking at. This quality was not incidental. It was the point. The entire room was designed to produce this effect, and every material decision from the foil backing to the placement of the candle brackets was made in service of it. The amber used in the room covered approximately 180 square meters of wall surface when fully installed, around 6 tons of it. In addition to the amber itself, the room incorporated gold leaf across its carved wooden decorative elements, the cornices, the pilasters, the ornamental framing of each section, so that the amber's honeytones were held within a structure of gilded wood that caught and redirected the light in its own right. The mirrored pilasters positioned at intervals along the walls served a different but related function. They reflected the amber and the candlelight back into the room at every angle, so that a person standing in the center of the space was surrounded not merely by amber panels, but by reflections of amber panels, receding in every direction in what observers consistently described as something like infinity, an effect of endless warm golden depth that the room's actual physical dimensions did not account for. The mirrors made the room larger than it was, and they made the amber more amber than it was, and the combined result was a space that appeared to operate by rules slightly different from those that governed ordinary rooms. 4 Florentine stone mosaic panels were set into the amber walls as pictorial insets, rectangular compositions depicting allegorical figures, assembled from stone in shades of gray and green and the particular rust ochre of Florentine hardstone work. These panels introduced a cooler, more restrained palette into the overall warmth of the room, and they served partly as compositional anchors, fixed points of pictorial clarity in the surrounding field of amber's more diffuse glow. The effect of setting cooler stone mosaics against the amber background was counterintuitive in outcome. The cooler panels made the amber around them appear to glow more intensely. The contrast between the stone's quiet grays and greens and the amber's deep honey tones, sharpening the warmth of the amber by providing something different to measure it against. Rastrelli had understood this principle that contrast amplifies rather than diminishes, and had used it deliberately, the Florentine panels functioning as much as optical instruments as decorative objects, their cool tones serving the warmth of everything around them. The room was arranged in 3 decorative tiers, rising from floor to ceiling. The lowest tier consisted of the main amber panels in their foil-backed frames, covering the primary wall surface at eye level and above. The middle tier moved into carved and gilded wooden elements, interspersed with smaller amber sections, and the mirrored pilasters, the visual complexity increasing as the eye traveled upward. The highest tier continued the gilded carved work toward the ceiling, the amber tones fading gradually into the gold of the ceiling itself, so that the boundary between wall and ceiling was not a hard line, but a gradual transition, the room's warmth rising and spreading as it reached its upper limits. A visitor standing in the center of this space on a winter evening when all the candelabra were lit, and there were hundreds of candles in this room, positioned to maximize the interaction of light with amber and mirror and foil, would have experienced something that is genuinely difficult to reconstruct from written description alone. The photographs that survive from before the room's removal in 1941 are in black and white, and they show the structure clearly, the tiers, the pilasters, the placement of the mosaics, but they cannot show the color, and it is the color in every account that survives that was the thing. Contemporary observers at the Russian imperial court used specific language when they tried to describe the room. The phrase that appears with the most consistency across visitor accounts from multiple countries and across more than a century of occupation is some variation of warmth, internal warmth, supernatural warmth, the warmth of sunlight preserved in stone and returned to the air. One account from the mid-18th century describes the room as appearing to generate its own weather, a microclimate of amber light that was perceptibly different from the colder air of the palace corridor outside the door. Another describes the sensation of entering the room for the first time as similar to the sensation of walking from shadow into sun, not the brightness of sun, but the warmth of it, the physical register of the light changing against the skin before the eye had fully registered what had changed. These are the accounts of people who visited many extraordinary rooms in many extraordinary palaces and who found this room unusual enough to reach for weather metaphors rather than architectural ones, as though what they were describing was an environment rather than a decoration. The room sat in its completed form in the Catherine Palace through the reign of Elizabeth and into the reign of Catherine the Great, who succeeded to the throne in 1762 and who governed the Russian Empire for 34 years with an appetite for culture and architecture that matched Elizabeth's own in ambition, if not always in aesthetic direction. Catherine the Great made modifications to the Catherine Palace, as she did to everything she inherited. She brought in other architects, added other rooms, recalibrated the building's relationship to the formal gardens that surrounded it. But the amber room she largely left as it was, a judgment that amounts to a kind of endorsement. She was not a ruler who left things she considered insufficient. The room's continued presence in the palace's principal sequence of ceremonial spaces, unchanged through her long reign, suggests she found nothing insufficient about it. The formal gardens at Tsarskoye Selo extended south and east from the palace in the ordered geometry of 18th century landscape design, parterres and allées, and reflecting pools, positioned according to the same principles of controlled perspective that Rastrelli had applied to the palace's interiors. The gardens were designed to be seen from the palace windows, and the palace was designed to be approached through the gardens, the long yellow facade revealing itself gradually as a visitor moved along the formal approach from the main entrance. On a summer afternoon, the palace caught the light along its full length, the blue and white paint and the gold leaf trim producing an effect of extraordinary vividness against the green of the surrounding park, a building that appeared almost too deliberate, too concentrated in its visual effect to be entirely real. The amber room was positioned on the state floor to receive the afternoon light through windows that faced the gardens, so that on clear summer days the sunlight would enter the room at an angle that fell directly across the amber panels, adding natural light to the candlelight that the room was also designed to use. The two light sources, different in quality and color, and both used fully by the amber's complex reflective surfaces. The room accumulated a history of being described, in the sense that every significant visitor to the court who left a written account felt compelled to include the amber room in it. Ambassadors noted it in their dispatches. Travelers included it in their published accounts of Russian court life. The descriptions varied in their specific details, but were consistent in their register of qualified astonishment, the astonishment of people who had expected something extraordinary and found that the reality exceeded the expectation, which is not the common outcome of anticipated marvels. Most extraordinary things, encountered after significant prior description, are slightly less than the description prepared for. The amber room was apparently one of the rare exceptions, a room that arrived at more than its reputation, that exceeded the accounts visitors had read before they walked through its door. This consistency across accounts spanning more than a century, different writers, different languages, different national traditions of what constituted proper written expression, suggests something real about the room's quality, a physical property of the space that translated reliably into the same register of experience, regardless of who was experiencing it. By the time of the 19th century, the room had been part of the Catherine Palace, long enough to have become simply a fact about it, not a remarkable recent addition, but an established and permanent feature of the building, as integrated into its identity as the facade or the formal gardens. Visitors to the palace expected it the way they expected the formal gardens to be formal and the palace to be large. It was the particular and irreplaceable version of a thing they had come to see. The craftsmen who maintained it over the decades, because amber requires maintenance, because the panels shifted slightly with changes in humidity and temperature, because the foil backing could deteriorate, because pieces occasionally came loose from their mounts and needed resecuring, understood the room in the way that conservators understand things they have worked with for a long time, as a material object with specific vulnerabilities and specific needs, demanding a specific quality of attention that was not quite like the attention required by marble or wood or canvas. The amber was both harder and more fragile than it appeared. It could be cleaned, but not with moisture. It could be stabilized, but not restored to its original condition once a piece had been damaged. Every repair was a conservation decision made in the knowledge that the original material was finite and that nothing exactly like it would ever be produced again. The room continued through the reign of Alexander I and Nicholas I and Alexander II and Alexander III, through the emancipation of the serfs and the building of the Trans-Siberian Railway and the long administrative transformation of the Russian Empire into something increasingly complicated and increasingly strained. The palace at Tsarskoye Selo remained what it had always been, a summer residence, a ceremonial space, a place where the court gathered at specific points in the calendar and where the rooms were opened, aired, staffed, and used as they had been designed to be used. The amber room opened with the palace and closed with the palace and was cleaned and inspected and maintained in the intervals between decade after decade, its amber panels aging very slowly in the way that amber ages, becoming, if anything, slightly richer in tone over time, the pale yellows deepening, the cognac shades intensifying, the room perhaps more itself at the end of the 19th century than it had been when it was installed. Amber does not fade in the way that paint fades or fabric fades. It deepens, it becomes more concentrated. The room that the 19th century knew was in certain respects more vivid than the room that the 18th century had made. Nicholas II was the last Russian Tsar to use the Catherine Palace as it had been designed to be used. He and his family spent significant time at Tsarskoye Selo. It was in many ways their preferred residence, the place where they were most themselves rather than most imperial, and the palace continued to function as a court space under his reign, with all the apparatus of servants and ceremonies and seasonal schedules that had governed it for a century and a half. The Amber Room was part of this. It was opened for visitors. It was maintained by the palace's conservation staff. It was included in accounts of the palace published during the late imperial period, as a matter of course, mentioned with the same confident permanence with which all fixed features of long-established institutions are mentioned when no one has yet imagined that they might not remain fixed. The accounts from this period do not describe the room as though it might someday not be there. There is no premonition in them. The room was simply there, as it had always been, glowing in the afternoon light from the garden-facing windows, the amber as warm as it had been in the decade it was installed, the mirrored pilasters still doing their work of multiplying the candlelight in every direction. The revolution of 1917 changed the status of the palace without immediately changing the palace itself. The Catherine Palace became a museum, its contents cataloged, and its rooms open to a public that had not previously had access to them. The Amber Room was included in the museum's permanent display, its significance now described in a different register, not as a possession of the imperial family, but as a cultural object of historical and artistic importance, belonging to the people rather than to the rulers, its value now phrased in terms of heritage rather than prestige. The conservation staff continued their work. The amber continued to be maintained. The room continued to receive visitors and to produce in them, according to accounts from the Soviet period, the same quality of surprised warmth that it had produced in visitors for 2 centuries. The regime had changed, the room had not. What the room looked like in the summer of 1941, in the last weeks before the German advance made its evacuation necessary and then impossible, can be recovered from photographs taken in the late 1930s and from the written accounts of palace staff and visitors from that period. The walls glowed in 3 tiers. The Florentine mosaics sat in their correct positions. The mirrored pilasters reflected the amber light in every direction, the depth of the reflections appearing to extend the room beyond its actual walls into something that seemed to have no fixed boundary. The afternoon light came through the garden-facing windows at its usual angle. The room looked exactly as it had looked for nearly 2 centuries, the amber perhaps a shade warmer in tone than it had been when Rastrelli's craftsmen finished installing it. The whole space settled and permanent and completely itself, the accumulated weight of 180 years of continuous presence, giving it the quality that only very old and very undisturbed things possess, the quality of seeming inevitable, of seeming like exactly what the space had always been waiting to contain. This is the room that palace curators attempted to protect in the summer of 1941, when the German advance made its safety uncertain. This is the room whose amber crumbled at the edges when the conservation staff tried to remove the panels, the amber too brittle, too old, too settled into its backing to be safely moved by any method available in the time and circumstances they had. The curators laid cotton wadding and gauze against the panels. They hung wallpaper over sections of the walls. They did what they could with what they had in the time that remained, and what they could do was not enough to make the room invisible or to protect it from the judgment of people who had come specifically to find it. The room had been described in too many accounts, documented in too many photographs, noted in too many official records, to be hidden behind wallpaper in a palace that German forces had been advancing toward for months. It was too well known. It had been too thoroughly described. Its presence in the Catherine Palace was, by 1941, simply a fact about the world, the kind of fact that does not require verification because it has been true for long enough that its truth is assumed without examination. On a summer evening under Empress Elizabeth, sometime in the 1750s, after Rastrelli had finished the installation, the room would have been lit by all the candles the palace's household staff could arrange in the brackets and candelabra positioned throughout the space. The accounts suggest there were around 565 candles in the room when it was fully lit for formal occasions, a number specific enough to have come from some administrative record of candle consumption, precise enough to suggest that someone counted, that the number mattered, and that the lighting of the room was an act taken seriously enough to be recorded and reproduced with consistency. 565 candles in a room with amber walls backed by gold and silver foil, with mirrored pilasters reflecting the light in every direction, with gilded carved cornices, and the ceiling above painted in tones that allowed the warmth to rise all the way to the top of the space without a hard boundary. The light produced by that number of candles in that configuration of reflective surfaces would have been, by all the accounts that survive, something worth traveling to see, something worth describing, something that remained with the people who saw it, that found its way into dispatches and travel memoirs and private correspondence, that produced in person, again and again, the same quality of experience that almost no room in the world has ever consistently produced in the people who entered it. The quiet impossibility of a room that everyone who saw it apparently found more than they had prepared for, and that sat in its palace for 180 years glowing warmly in the afternoon light, waiting as all beautiful things wait to be seen again. In the Catherine Palace on the state floor, in the third week of September 1941, 3 days after German forces had entered the building, a corridor ran the full length of the eastern wing in near silence. The double doors at the far end stood open. From somewhere inside the room beyond those doors came a sound that did not belong in a palace. The careful, methodical scrape of tools working against a surface that was not made to be worked against, and beneath that, at intervals, the small brittle crack of amber giving way. The Soviet curators who had been responsible for this room had known the German advance was coming. They had known it since July, which had given them almost 2 months to attempt something that turned out to be impossible. The amber panels of the Catherine Palace's most celebrated interior were, by the summer of 1941, nearly 2 centuries old. The resin that had preserved insects and air bubbles and suspended fragments of prehistoric forest for 40 million years had not, as it turned out, been improved by 200 years of palace life, by the expansion and contraction of heated rooms in Russian winters, by the slow settling of the building beneath them, by the accumulated vibration of a palace in continuous institutional use. When the curators had attempted to remove the first panels from their backing frames in the weeks after the German invasion began, the amber had simply crumbled at the edges. Pieces that had survived their original transport from Berlin to St. Petersburg in 1717, that had been dismantled and reinstalled at least once during the intervening century, that had been cleaned and maintained and lit and admired without interruption, now fell apart under the hands of people trying to save them. The curators had made a decision. They had covered the panels in gauze, then in cotton wadding, then in a layer of wallpaper over the top of both, a kind of archaeological bandaging applied to something they could neither move nor adequately protect, in the hope that the covering might obscure what lay beneath it. The hope did not hold. German forces entered the Catherine Palace on September 17, 1941, and whatever the wallpaper had concealed was not concealed from the soldiers and art specialists, who arrived shortly afterward, knowing exactly what they were looking for and where, within the palace, it would be found. The man who directed the dismantling that followed was Alfred Roda. He was a German art historian, a specialist in Baltic amber, with an established scholarly reputation, and the director of the Prussia Sammlung Museum in Königsberg. His qualifications for this particular assignment were both professional and geographical. Königsberg was the historical center of European amber culture, the administrative capital of East Prussia, and the city closest to the Samland Peninsula, where the amber for the original panels had been mined from Baltic coastal deposits across the preceding centuries. Rodi had spent his career in a city that understood itself as the natural home of amber in all its cultural and material dimensions, and his assignment to oversee the removal of the amber room was not an improvised decision made in the chaos of occupation. It reflected the organized structure of German cultural looting policy, administered through the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the office that had been established specifically to systematize the seizure and transfer of art and cultural property in occupied Soviet territories, operating with the institutional thoroughness of a ministry rather than the opportunism of individual soldiers. Rode arrived at the Catherine Palace as an authorized specialist with a clear mandate. He moved through the room and assessed the panels. He directed the German soldiers assigned to assist him in the use of the tools required. The cotton wadding and the wallpaper came away, the amber beneath them, honeyed, cognac-colored, foil-backed and mirror-flanked and still glowing in the September light through the palace's tall windows, was intact. What followed over the next 36 hours was not destruction. It was, in its particular way, the opposite of destruction, a careful dismantling conducted by someone who understood the material too well to treat it carelessly, guided by the same specialist knowledge that made Rhoda valuable to the institutions that had sent him. The amber panels were removed from their backing frames, section by section. The carved wooden elements, the gilded cornices, the ornamented pilasters, the decorative fixtures that framed and supported the amber tiers, were detached from the walls. The 4 Florentine stone mosaic panels that had been set into the amber field, their cooler gray and rust and green palette making the warm amber around them appear to burn more intensely, came away from their niches. Everything was assessed, organized, and packed. The packing required 27 crates. The original 1717 transport from Berlin to St. Petersburg had required 18. The difference reflected the room's expanded dimensions. Bartolomeo Rastrelli had designed and added new amber sections when he adapted the Prussian panels to the larger Catherine Palace Hall, and those additional elements now required 9 further crates beyond what the original transport had needed. Each crate was packed with the care appropriate to its contents. The amber pieces nested in material that would cushion them against the vibration of the journey ahead. The crates were stenciled with inventory numbers and logged against a manifest. Roddy signed for the lot. The journey back to Königsberg was by rail. Freight cars moving westward through the occupied Polish corridor in the autumn of 1941, past landscapes that were themselves being transformed by the same war that had opened the Catherine Palace to German forces, through territory that had changed hands before and would change hands again before the war was over. The amber inside those 27 crates had made a long journey to reach Russia in the first place. The Baltic coast, amber from the Samland deposits, had been worked into panels in Berlin at the beginning of the 18th century, transported to St. Petersburg in 17, adapted and expanded for the Catherine Palace in the 1750s, and displayed there for the better part of 200 years before Soviet curators had tried and failed to remove it in the summer of 1941. It was now traveling back in the general direction from which it had come, toward the Baltic coast, toward the city that considered itself amber's natural home. Rohuda received the crates in Königsberg. He logged them into the Königsberg Castle inventory with the same methodical attention he had brought to the dismantling. The castle was a large Gothic and Renaissance brick complex in the center of the East Prussian capital, a building that had accumulated its current form across several centuries, its oldest sections dating to the 13th century, its ground floor comprising a series of large formal halls that had served various administrative and ceremonial functions over the course of its long history. One of these ground floor halls was designated as the new home for the amber panels. Workers uncrated the components under Radda's supervision. The inventory was checked against the manifest from the Catherine Palace. The pieces were sorted and prepared for reinstallation. The reinstallation took time, more time than the original dismantling had, because dismantling does not require precision in the way that installation does. But by 1942, the room was back on walls. The amber panels that had been stripped from the Catherine Palace in late September 1941 were now mounted in a Königsberg Castle Hall, glowing again under the electric lights that had replaced the candelabras of the Russian imperial period, accessible to selected visitors and Nazi officials who came to see the room that had, according to the official cultural framing of its relocation, been returned to its rightful home. Rolda was not simply an administrator who happened to have been assigned to this project. He was intellectually and professionally invested in it. During the period when the Amber Room was installed in Königsberg Castle, he published scholarly articles arguing the case for the room's historical connection to the city, that Königsberg, as the center of the European amber trade and the amber working tradition, was the appropriate permanent location for the most elaborate amber interior ever constructed. The articles were written in the formal register of German academic scholarship, published in journals, and they made their argument through the historical record rather than through explicitly political language. Rhoda cited the guild traditions of the Samland amber workers, the centuries of amber expertise concentrated in the East Prussian capital, the cultural logic of returning the material to its regional source. The argument had a coherence that was separate from the circumstances of the room's relocation, even if those circumstances were entirely what had made the relocation possible. The visitors who came to see the room during the 1942 and 1943 period found it glowing quietly in its new setting. A ground floor hall in a castle in East Prussia was not the Catherine Palace. The formal gardens of Tsarskoye Selo, the long yellow and white Baroque facade of the imperial complex, the established ceremonial context of a palace that had been receiving visitors for the better part of 2 centuries, none of that surrounded the room anymore. But the amber itself was the same amber. The Florentine mosaic panels were in their positions. The carved wooden elements framed the tiers as they had always done. The mirrored pilasters, which in the Catherine Palace had extended the candlelight inward into what observers had consistently described as an effect of infinite golden warmth, now reflected the electric lights of the castle hall back and forth across the room's interior. The hall was quiet on winter afternoons when no visitors were scheduled. An attendant might have walked through it at the end of the day, checking that everything was in order before the castle closed, noting nothing unusual. The amber panels that had spent 200 years in a Russian imperial palace now spent their evenings in silence in a German castle city, waiting in the dark for the morning light, the same material they had always been, the same color, the same depth, the same 40-million-year-old interior, a different room around them, a different city outside the window, the war continuing in every direction beyond the castle walls. The RAF bombing raids on Königsberg in the summer of 1944 changed the castle's condition materially. The raids of late August damaged sections of the castle's structure, and Rhoda was among those who moved through the interior in the aftermath to assess what had survived. His correspondence from this period, letters sent to colleagues and to the cultural authorities overseeing the castle's collections, recorded that the Amber Hall had come through the bombing without catastrophic damage. The panels were still on the walls. The structural condition of the castle was now seriously compromised in other sections, and the raids had made visible the degree to which Königsberg itself had moved into range of the war in a way it had not been before. But the room had survived. This correspondence, these specific letters in which Rhoda reported the Amber's survival in the autumn of 1944, would later become significant, not because of what they confirmed, but because of when they stopped being reliable. They represent the last clear documented accounting of the room's condition by the person with the best knowledge of its state. After the late 1944 letters, the chain of direct, authoritative documentation becomes uncertain in ways that have never been resolved. A German soldier named Paul Feyerabend provided an account gathered after the war's end, in which he described visiting the room in January 1945 and finding the panels still largely intact and visible on the castle walls. The account has been taken seriously by researchers because it is specific about its own conditions. Feyerabend described the time of his visit, the state of the hall, what he could see from where he stood. But alongside Feyerabend's account, other post-war testimonies from people who were in the castle during the same period described something different. A hall in which the panels had already been removed from the walls and repacked into crates in preparation for evacuation. The amber gone from the walls before January 1945. The crates already staged and waiting for transport. Both of these accounts cannot be correct simultaneously. The contradiction between them is not a minor discrepancy in an otherwise clear record. It is the fundamental ambiguity at the center of the room's disappearance, the place where the documented chain breaks and the mystery properly begins. The East Prussian Gauleiter, Erich Koch, reportedly issued orders for the Amber Room's evacuation from Königsberg as Soviet forces advanced westward through the winter and spring of 1945. This is what the post-war record indicates, but no authenticated transport document has ever been produced that records the room's actual removal from the castle. No freight manifest, no rail booking, no harbor record, no signature from a transport officer acknowledging receipt of 27 crates. The administrative apparatus that had been meticulous enough to log the room into the Königsberg Castle inventory in 1941, that had produced scholarly articles and visitor registers and official correspondence throughout the 3 years of the room's residence in the castle, produced no verified paper trail for what happened to it at the end. The final weeks of Königsberg in 1945 were not weeks in which administrative thoroughness was possible. The city was under siege. Civilian and military authority were collapsing simultaneously. The physical infrastructure of record keeping, the offices, the filing systems, the clerks who maintained them, was being destroyed along with everything else. If an evacuation occurred, the conditions under which it occurred were precisely the conditions most likely to prevent it from being documented. Soviet forces under Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky captured Königsberg on April 9, 1945, after 4 days of urban combat that left the city substantially destroyed. Among the units that entered the city in the aftermath of its capture were specialized Soviet trophy brigades, teams assembled specifically to locate and recover cultural property that had been looted from Soviet territories during the German occupation. Their mandate was precise: to find the things that had been taken and to begin the process of returning them. They entered Königsberg Castle as part of this systematic recovery effort. The amber display hall on the castle's ground floor, when the trophy brigade reached it, was empty. The walls were bare. The pale rectangular outlines, where the amber panels had rested for 3 years, remained on the plaster, faint shadows of a room that had been there and was no longer there. The discoloration of the backing material having left a record of the panel's dimensions on the wall behind them. On the floor of the hall there was debris, broken plaster, structural material from the bombing damage, the kind of accumulated disorder that a building under siege accumulates when no one is maintaining it. The Florentine mosaic niches were empty. The mirrored pilasters were gone. The carved wooden elements had been removed. Nothing remained in the hall that indicated where the contents had gone, or when, or by what means. The Trophy Brigade report documenting the absence was written on a standard military document form, handwritten in Russian by an officer whose name appears in the record. The relevant field noted the absence of the amber room and requested further investigative authorization from the appropriate Soviet cultural authorities. It was a bureaucratic document, careful, specific, operating within its institutional format, and it marked the moment when the official search for the room formally began. The room had last been confirmed present it was now confirmed absent. Everything in between those two data points was, from the perspective of the Soviet investigators, unknown territory. The Soviet investigators turned, naturally, to the person most likely to know what had happened. Alfred Rode had been in Königsberg throughout the war, had overseen the room's installation, had maintained the scholarly and administrative record of its residents in the castle, and had been physically present in the city during the period when the room either survived or did not survive its final weeks. He was questioned briefly by Soviet investigators in the months following the city's capture. He told them he did not know where the room had gone. He said he had no information about an evacuation. He gave them, according to the notes taken during these sessions, nothing that opened a new line of investigation or resolved the contradiction between the fire band account and the accounts that described the panels already removed from the walls before January 1945. Rode died in December 1945, along with his wife. The cause was attributed to typhus, which was present in the severely disrupted post-war conditions of the former East Prussian capital, now in the process of becoming the Soviet city of Kaliningrad. His death ended the questioning before it had produced anything useful, and it removed from the investigation the single person with the deepest and most direct knowledge of the room's entire Königsberg history. The man who had logged it in, supervised its installation, maintained it through 3 years of wartime, written about it in scholarly journals, and been present in the city during the period when it disappeared. The Soviet investigators who had questioned him were left with the notes from those sessions, a few pages of cramped writing in a small notebook, recording answers that had led nowhere and questions that had not been followed up in time. Those notes exist in the archive. What they document is a conversation that went quiet before it was finished, and that could not be reopened once the man who held the relevant knowledge was gone. The hall in Königsberg Castle remained empty in the sense that mattered. The pale rectangular marks on the plaster walls did not change. The floor debris was not a legible record of what had happened. The building itself, damaged by the RAF raids and by the urban combat of April 1945, continued to deteriorate in the years that followed, as the city around it underwent its transformation from a German East Prussian capital into a Soviet administrative center with a new name and a population that had not been there before the war. The castle that had housed the amber panels stood in the center of this transformed city, its upper sections increasingly unstable, its ground floor halls accessible to investigators and eventually to the public in the irregular way of a building that no one had quite decided what to do with. The railroad yards on the edge of the city in February 1945 had been a place of concentrated and barely organized movement. Military vehicles, refugee wagons, freight cars being loaded under conditions of cold and pressure and institutional collapse, the kind of scene that generates a great deal of physical activity and very little reliable documentation. If 27 crates were loaded onto a freight car in those yards at some point in the final weeks before the Soviet forces arrived, they would have been part of that general movement. They would have required a manifest, a destination, a receiving officer at the other end. They might have had all of these things, and the papers might have been lost in transit or destroyed with the office that would have held copies, or simply never filed in the chaos of the city's final weeks. If the crates were there and moving, the conditions of their movement were the least favorable imaginable for leaving a legible paper trail. If they were not there, if the amber had burned in the castle during the RAF raids, or during the urban combat of April 1945, or if some other fate had overtaken it before any evacuation could be organized, Then the empty hall with its pale rectangular wall markings was the room's final condition, and the 27 crates had ceased to exist before the Soviet trophy brigades arrived to find their absence. Both of these possibilities are held by the record in the same way. Neither is confirmed, neither is excluded. The contradiction between the Firebend account and the accounts suggesting prior recrating, the absence of any verified transport document, the empty hall, the dead custodian, the notes that recorded nothing useful. These facts surround the question without answering it, and they have surrounded it without change since the spring of 1945. The hall in the castle is the last known location. The bare plaster walls with their rectangular outlines are the last confirmed evidence. What moved through the Königsberg railroad yards in the winter of 1945 is unknown. What burned in the castle fires, if amber burned there, is unknown. The 27 crates are the last material form in which the room existed as a documented object, and where those crates went, whether they moved, whether they survived, whether they still exist in some form somewhere beneath the transformed landscape of what is now Kaliningrad, is the question that the record cannot answer. What the record can hold is the shape of the absence, the pale marks on the plaster of a ground floor hall in a damaged castle, the brief and inconclusive sessions between Soviet investigators and the dying custodian of 3 years of amber history, the railroad yards full of movement in the cold of February 1945, the freight cars moving in every direction, the paper trail that should exist and does not, the hall quiet again on a winter afternoon in the rebuilt Soviet city, the empty niches where the Florentine mosaics had been positioned, the flat pale walls where the amber had glowed for 3 years in a room that was neither here nor there, not the room it had been built to be, not the room it had been made into, but a room in a castle in a city that had 6 months to live as a city before it became something else entirely. The amber itself, the panels packed into their 27 crates, if they were packed, if they moved, if they arrived somewhere, was the same material it had always been. The same honey and cognac colors that Gottfried Wolfram had fitted into backing frames in a Berlin workshop at the beginning of the 18th century. The same Baltic coast resin that had closed around prehistoric air and insect and fragment of 40-million-year-old forest and preserved them through geological time. The amber did not know about the war. It did not know about Rhoda or Rastrelli or Friedrich Wilhelm I or the diplomatic exchange of tall soldiers for an irreplaceable interior. It carried its own time inside it, the long, slow time of geological deposit, of compression and preservation, of amber guild craft and royal commission and diplomatic gift and imperial installation and Nazi seizure and wartime journey, and in whatever condition it was in at the end of 1945, whether ash or intact, in a freight car moving west or in the rubble of a bombed castle hall. It carried all of that time in its interior exactly as it had always done. Rhoda's scholarly articles from the Königsberg period, the carefully argued claims that this room and this city had always belonged together, that the Samland Coast amber had a natural home in the culture and institutional history of East Prussia's capital, remained in the journals where they had been published. They did not disappear with their author. They sat in library collections through the post-war decades, a record of the intellectual framework Rodet had built around his custody of the room, the argument that had made his assignment feel, at least to him, like something more than looting. The argument can be evaluated separately from the circumstances that made it possible to advance. It is not a strong argument in historical terms. The room had been designed in Berlin for a Prussian court, gifted diplomatically to a Russian Tsar, adapted by an Italian architect for a Russian imperial palace, and had spent the vast majority of its existence in Russia rather than anywhere near Königsberg. But Rhoda made it in the scholarly register with the scholarly tools available to him, and the articles exist in the record alongside everything else that Rhoda left behind when he died in December 1945, before the Soviet investigators could ask the questions that most needed to be asked, and before the answers could be written down. The Trophy Brigade officer who wrote the report, noting the empty hall in April 1945, was doing the work he had been assigned to do. He recorded what he found. He requested authorization for further investigation. The report went into the administrative system, and the investigation began its long life as an official, unsolved case, passing through Soviet bureaucratic structures and then Russian bureaucratic structures over the decades that followed, accumulating archive pages without accumulating a resolution. The hall itself, in the building at the center of the changing city, remained as bare as it had been on the day the Trophy Brigade arrived. The rectangular marks on the plaster slowly fading as the years passed and the building deteriorated and was eventually demolished in the 1960s, leaving the former site of the Amber Hall under the open sky, and then under the construction that followed, and then under the surface of the transformed city that had grown over it. What the September 1941 dismantling had taken 36 hours to accomplish, the careful stripping of a room that had stood for almost 2 centuries, the packing of its contents into 27 crates left behind in the Catherine Palace, only the pale outlines on the wall and the cotton wadding and gauze the Soviet curators had applied in their failed attempt at concealment. The room that had been there was gone. The room that received the amber panels in Königsberg was a different room, temporarily, provisionally, in a city that had fewer than 4 years to hold them, and then that room was empty too, and the amber was somewhere else, or nowhere, and the 2 sets of pale wall outlines, one in a Russian imperial palace, one in a German castle hall, were all that remained of a room that had been, on a summer evening in the Catherine Palace under Empress Elizabeth, something that visitors had consistently found impossible to describe in adequate terms. The empty hall in Königsberg Castle, as the Soviet Trophy Brigade found it in April 1945, was quiet. The debris on the floor did not answer questions. The pale rectangular shadows on the walls recorded dimensions, but not destinations. Outside, the city was in the process of its violent transformation. Inside the hall, in the specific silence of a room from which something irreplaceable had been removed, the question of where 27 crates had gone in the final weeks of a collapsing city settled into the stillness like something that intended to remain exactly there, patient, undisturbed, resting in the particular silence of things that have become impossible to account for. The room had been there, then it was not. The walls held the record of its presence in the only form that remained, the pale shadows of what had glowed against them for 3 years, already beginning to fade as the spring light of 1945 came through the castle windows into a hall that had nothing left to illuminate. On the morning after the first bombing raid, the 27th of August, 1944, Alfred Rohde made his way through the damaged interior of Königsberg Castle, while the upper stairwells still held faint traces of smoke. He moved carefully through the corridors, past fallen plaster and the grit of pulverized stone, toward the ground floor hall where the amber panels had been installed 2 years before. The RAF had come at night. Now the morning light came through windows whose glass had been shattered by concussion, and the dust of the castle's upper floors had settled across everything in a thin gray film. Robdev reached the hall. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he stepped inside, and the amber was still there, the panels still fixed to the walls, the surfaces intact, the honey-colored tiers rising in the same configuration he had documented in his scholarly articles, still glowing faintly, even in the gray morning light that came through the broken windows. He took out a notebook and wrote what he saw. What he wrote in that notebook, and in the correspondence he sent to German cultural authorities in the days that followed, constitutes the last broadly confirmed report of the amber room surviving in a recognizable and largely undamaged state, a document that would become the fixed point around which every subsequent account of the room's disappearance would eventually orbit. The bombing raids of late August 1944 had caused serious structural damage to Königsberg Castle without, according to Rode's assessment, destroying the amber collection housed within it. 2 raids had come within 3 nights of each other, the first on the night of the 26th, the second on the 29th, and between them they had torn open sections of the castle's roof and left its upper floors exposed and compromised.
Rode's correspondence from this period is careful in its language. He noted the castle's structural condition as seriously degraded. He noted the risk that further raids could produce different results. What he did not report was any catastrophic damage to the amber panels themselves. And this is the detail that later investigators would return to repeatedly, because it establishes that the room survived at least until the autumn of 1944 in something approaching its installed condition.
Which means the question of what happened to it belongs entirely to the final months of the war, to the compressed and chaotic period between that August morning and the Soviet capture of the city in April 1945. The winter that followed was the last winter Königsberg would spend as a functioning German city. The Soviet advance through East Prussia had begun in January 1945, and the pace of it was steady and inexorable in a way that made the situation legible to anyone paying attention. Erich Koch, the East Prussian Gauleiter, had issued orders relating to the evacuation of cultural valuables, and the Amber Room's fate entered a period whose documentation becomes, at precisely this point, deeply and perhaps permanently unreliable. What the record establishes is that orders were given. What the record cannot establish, and what no archive consulted in the decades since has been able to produce, is any authenticated transport document confirming that the 27 amber crates were actually loaded, actually moved, actually removed from Königsberg Castle and directed somewhere else before the city fell. The orders existed. The execution of those orders is where the record goes quiet, and it stays quiet in a way that may simply reflect the collapse of the administrative apparatus responsible for keeping it. A soldier named Paul Feyerabend provided a post-war account describing the Amber Room as still visible on the castle walls in January 1945. The amber panels were there, he said. The hall was still intact. This account places the room in the castle roughly 3 months after Rode's August correspondence, and roughly 3 months before the Soviet forces arrived. But there are other accounts from the same weeks of January 1945 that suggest something different, that the panels had already come down from the walls by that point, that crates had been assembled, that the room was in the process of being prepared for transport. These two versions do not resolve into each other. They have never been reconciled by investigators. Feyerabend's description of amber still on walls and the contradictory accounts of amber already in crates represent the fundamental ambiguity at the center of the room's disappearance, the split in the record that makes every subsequent theory branch in a different direction, and none of them can be ruled out by any evidence that has so far been found. The city itself, in those final months, was not a place where records were being carefully maintained. Königsberg, in early 1945, was a city that knew what was coming. The rail lines west were crowded with refugees and military traffic in conditions that even official German accounts described as chaotic. The administrative structures that would normally have generated and preserved transport documentation were operating in varying states of collapse. If the crates were moved, and the possibility that they were moved remains entirely open, then they were moved in conditions almost perfectly designed to prevent any reliable accounting of where they went. And if they were not moved, if they were still in the castle when the fires of the final battle reached the ground floor, then they burned in conditions almost perfectly designed to prevent any reliable accounting of that either. The absence of documentation does not point toward either outcome. It points only toward itself, toward a final period of such general disorder that the ordinary mechanisms of record keeping had ceased to function. The Soviet army under Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky captured Königsberg on the 9th of April, 1945, after 4 days of urban combat that left the city's historic center heavily damaged. Among the units that entered the city in the days following its fall were the Soviet trophy brigades, specialized formations whose specific mission was the recovery of looted Soviet cultural property from German occupation. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were trained for this work, equipped with inventories and documentation from Soviet cultural institutions, directed by cultural authorities who had been compiling records of what the Germans had taken throughout the occupation of Western Russia. The trophy brigades entered Königsberg Castle. They made their way to the ground floor hall where the amber panels had been installed. They found bare walls. The hall was empty. The plaster behind where the panels had been installed for nearly 3 years was pale and faintly discolored at the edges. The rectangular impressions of frames and backing panels, still faintly readable on the wall surface, marking the precise dimensions of what had been there and was no longer. There was debris on the floor. There was evidence of fire damage and of water. But the amber was gone, and the crates were gone, and there was nothing in the hall to indicate where either had been taken, or when, or by whose order, or in what direction. The trophy brigade filed a report. The report noted the absence of the amber room. The report requested further investigative authorization. It was a standard military document, filled out on a standard template, and the relevant field, the one that would have recorded the location of the 27 crates, was simply blank. That blank field is in one sense the formal beginning of the mystery. Everything that came before it, the diplomatic gift, the decades of installation in the Catherine Palace, the seizure and the rail journey to Königsberg, the 3 years of display in a castle that was slowly being compromised by the war around it. All of that produced a documented sequence that, however much it crossed borders and changed hands, could be followed. The Trophy Brigade's report is where the sequence stops. After April 1945, the Amber Room has no confirmed address. The Soviet investigators, who were assigned to follow the trail in the months and years after the war, found themselves working with a record that had been shaped by catastrophe on both sides. German cultural and administrative archives relating to the final period in Königsberg were scattered, burned, or deliberately destroyed in the chaos of the collapse. The German officials who had handled the room's Königsberg custody, the people who would have known what evacuation orders had actually been executed, which transport had actually departed, where any manifest had been filed, were either dead, dispersed across the occupation zones of a divided Germany, or disinclined to assist Soviet investigators for reasons that needed no explanation in the immediate post-war period. The record had not so much been sealed as dissolved. Rhoda himself was still alive when the Soviets took Königsberg. He had remained in the city through its fall, and Soviet investigators found him and questioned him in the weeks that followed. The sessions produced a few pages of handwritten notes, a Soviet investigator's cramped notation in a small notebook, recording questions asked and answers given across what appear to have been brief and inconclusive meetings. Rhoda told the investigators that he did not know where the room had gone. He told them he had received orders relating to evacuation, but could not account for whether those orders had been carried out. He told them he had not personally supervised any removal of the crates from the castle in the final weeks before the city's fall. Whether any of this was true, the investigators could not determine. They scheduled further sessions. They did not take place. Alfred Rhoda died in December 1945 in Königsberg along with his wife. The cause of death was recorded as typhus, which was not an implausible cause in a city that had undergone the conditions Königsberg had undergone in 1945. Typhus was present. The city's infrastructure had been destroyed. The conditions that produce epidemic disease were present throughout the occupation zone, and yet the timing of Rhoda's death, weeks after being briefly questioned by the Soviet investigators who most needed his testimony, before any further sessions could be arranged, taking with him whatever detailed knowledge he held of the room's Königsberg history and its final months in the castle, has been noted by every serious researcher who has worked on the case since. The record is ambiguous. The death may have been entirely what it appeared to be. The record does not confirm otherwise. What it confirms is that the one person who had been professionally responsible for the Amber Room throughout its entire Königsberg period, who had logged it into the castle inventory, who had written scholarly articles about it, who had inspected it after the bombing raids and reported on its condition, and who had been present in the city through its fall. That person was dead before the Soviet investigation could meaningfully proceed, and the files he had kept were not recovered, and the knowledge he had held went with him. The question that the Soviet investigators could not answer in 1945, the question that German and Russian researchers could not answer through the decades that followed, and the question that the documentary record has not answered in the 80 years since the trophy brigades found those bare walls in Königsberg Castle, is simply this: where did the 27 crates go? It is not a complicated question in its structure. It does not require any elaborate interpretive framework to understand. It requires only one thing: a reliable account of what happened between the moment when the amber was last confirmed present and the moment when it was confirmed absent. And that account has not been found. What has been found across 80 years of searching is an accumulation of partial signals and unverified routes and contradictory testimonies that the record holds without resolving. There are the accounts of the rail lines west, the trains that left Königsberg in the final weeks of German control, carrying military equipment and civilians and the contents of official buildings, moving toward a Germany that was also in the process of collapse. The rail network from Königsberg westward through the Polish corridor and into central Germany was a documented method of transport in that period, and the possibility that 27 crates of amber traveled along it cannot be eliminated by any evidence so far reviewed. There are also the Baltic Sea routes, the German naval evacuation of East Prussia that moved hundreds of thousands of people and quantities of material by ship from the ports of the Samland Peninsula between January and April of 1945, a documented operation on a scale large enough to have accommodated significant freight alongside the human evacuees. The ships that participated in this evacuation are documented. Some of them sank. The manifests of what they carried, when manifests survived at all, have been reviewed by investigators and have not produced an authenticated record of the amber crates. The castle cellars have been excavated. The tunnel systems beneath the former footprint of Königsberg Castle and the surrounding blocks of what is now Kaliningrad have been probed in operations that stretched across decades and were conducted by Soviet and later Russian investigators with access to engineering equipment and ground-penetrating surveys. These excavations recovered other things, other artworks, other looted cultural property that the trophy brigades had missed, or that had been concealed in the castle's extensive basement systems. They did not recover the amber room. The amber panels were not behind the walls that were opened. They were not in the chambers that were found and unsealed. The excavations continued, and each round of them produced the same result, which is to say, no result regarding the thing being specifically sought, and the absence of the amber in the places that were searched establishes only that it was not in those places, not that it was somewhere else, and not that it was anywhere at all. The path of the investigation through the post-war decades runs through the same material repeatedly, approaching the same gap from different angles and finding that the gap remains. Soviet investigators in the late 1940s, East German and West German researchers in the 1950s and 1960s, working in parallel and without coordination across a divided country. Polish investigators, given the geography of likely transport routes. Independent researchers, private individuals who devoted years to the question and assembled files of testimony and documentary analysis. Each generation of investigation produced a clearer picture of the period leading up to the disappearance and a clearer picture of the absence that followed it. And the thing that remained consistently unclear was the interval between the specific days or weeks in early 1945 when 27 crates were either evacuated from Königsberg Castle by someone following an order or destroyed in the castle by the fires of the final siege, or dismantled and dispersed by persons unknown for purposes the record does not describe. There was a moment in the autumn of 1944 when Rhoda stood in the Amber Hall after the RAF raids and wrote in his notebook that the room had survived. That moment is documented. The notebook entry is part of the archival record. The relief in his correspondence, the cautious professional satisfaction of a specialist who had watched something irreplaceable come through a night of fire intact, is readable in the language he used, formal and precise, the language of a man who had spent his career studying amber and who had, for 3 years, been custodian of the most significant amber object in the world. He knew what he was looking at. He knew its age and its provenance and the labor that had gone into it and the improbability of its survival across 200 years. He stood in the hall in the gray morning light and wrote that it was still there. What he could not have written that morning, what no one could have known in August 1944, was that the months ahead would be the last period in which anyone could say with confidence where the room was. The autumn and winter and early spring that followed Rhoda's inspection are the months that the record covers incompletely, that survivor accounts describe inconsistently, and that the absence of authenticated transport documentation has left permanently open. Whether Rhoda himself knew what happened to the crates, whether he supervised their removal, or watched them taken by others, or simply found the hall empty one morning without explanation, cannot be established from anything the record contains. His notebook entry from that August morning in 1944 is one kind of document. The Soviet investigators' cramped notes from the brief and inconclusive interviews of late 1945 are another kind entirely. Between those two documents In the space they bracket without filling is where the question lives. The Soviet investigator who sat across from Rhoda in the final months of 1945 and wrote down his answers in the small notebook was doing what investigators do, trying to move from the last confirmed location of a thing to a credible account of where it went. The questions recorded in the notebook are methodical. The answers recorded alongside them are sparse and non-directive. A man describing orders he received without confirming whether they were carried out, describing a situation of general chaos without locating the amber within it, declining or unable to give the investigator the specific chain of custody that would have moved the inquiry forward. The notebook ends. Rhoda died. The investigator presumably filed the notebook and continued working with what it contained, which was essentially a description of the question rather than an answer to it. The bare walls of the amber display hall in Königsberg Castle, as the Trophy Brigade found them in April 1945, showed the pale rectangular shadows where the panels had been mounted. These shadows, the faint discoloration of plaster that had been covered by amber-mounted backing frames for 3 years, then exposed when the frames came down, were themselves a kind of documentation, the walls recording in their surface what had been pressed against them. The exact dimensions of the panels were readable in those shadows. The positions of the mounting fixtures were marked by the holes in the plaster. The hall's floor was littered with debris that included fragments of packing material, scraps of the wood used for crating, the small material traces of a dismantling that had happened in haste or in stages, or perhaps in both. None of this told the Trophy Brigade where the crates had gone. It told them only that the crates had existed and had been removed, and that the removal had happened before the Soviet army arrived. The wall shadows are gone now. Königsberg Castle was demolished by Soviet authorities in the 1960s, a decision made for a combination of ideological and structural reasons. The ruined building replaced eventually by a modern construction project that was itself never completed and stood for decades as a different kind of absence at the center of what is now Kaliningrad. The hall where Rhodey had installed the amber panels, where visitors had come to see them between 1942 and some point in the castle's final wartime year, where the Soviet Trophy Brigade had found only bare walls and debris in April 1945. That hall no longer exists as a physical space. The building that contained it was removed from the earth. The ground beneath it has been excavated to varying depths in the decades since, and the excavations have continued, and the amber has not been found in any of them. The physical absence of the castle adds a particular quality to the mystery. The last confirmed location of the amber room is a building that no longer stands, in a city that no longer has the name it had when the room was there, in a territory whose national identity has changed twice since the Trophy Brigades filed their report. The room was Russian when it was seized. It was in German hands when it disappeared. The city where it disappeared is now Russian again, the westernmost territory of the Russian Federation, a Baltic enclave separated from the Russian mainland by Lithuania and Belarus, a place where the history embedded in the ground is complicated in ways that make even well-intentioned archaeological investigation a matter requiring careful diplomatic management. The excavations that have been conducted under these conditions. Their results have been what they have been. What passed through Königsberg in 1944 and 1945 was not only the Amber Room. The city was a center of German cultural holdings, the Prussian archives, the collections of the Prussia Sammlung, significant private collections, objects looted from across occupied Eastern Europe and brought westward for storage, or display, or simply because the movement of armies produces the movement of everything armies carry with them. Some of what passed through Königsberg was recovered. Some of it sank in the Baltic. Some of it burned in the castle and in the city around the castle. Some of it traveled westward on the rail lines and is somewhere in the basements of institutions that have not examined their provenance documentation carefully enough to know what they hold. The Amber Room's disappearance belongs to this larger history of dispersal, and it is simultaneously distinct from it, distinct because of the room's scale, because of the labor embedded in it, because of the impossibility of moving 6 tons of amber panels across a war zone without leaving some trace that should, in principle, have survived. And yet no authenticated trace has survived. No manifest, no rail record, no ship log, no receipt from a receiving institution, no testimony from anyone who was present in Königsberg in the final weeks of German control that has been confirmed as reliable and that places the amber crates anywhere specific after they left the display hall. The absence is comprehensive in a way that continues to resist explanation, because in the ordinary course of even wartime events, something as large and valuable as the Amber Room tends to leave evidence of its movement, simply because so many people would have been required to move it, and at least some of them would have survived to describe what they did. The possibility that it burned is real and has been taken seriously by scholars who have reviewed the available evidence. The fires in Königsberg Castle during the RAF raids of August 1944 were significant, and the fires during the final battle in April 1945 were more significant still. Amber burns. It is a resin, combustible under the right conditions, and panels that had already been rendered fragile by age and the earlier handling during their 1941 dismantling may have been more vulnerable to heat damage than the room's pre-war condition would suggest. If the panels were still on the walls or in loosely packed crates when fire reached the ground floor hall, then the amber itself may simply be ash somewhere in the debris layer beneath what is now the center of Kaliningrad, and the reason no one has found it is that there is nothing left to find in any recognizable form. This outcome is not satisfying. It is not the kind of resolution that produces a clear final chapter, but the record does not exclude it, and the scholars who have reviewed the evidence most carefully have concluded that it cannot be dismissed as improbable. The wall shadows that the Trophy Brigade saw in April 1945 are the last physical trace the Amber Room left in any confirmed location. After that, the record has only absences: the empty hall, the missing crates, the incomplete testimonies, the investigations that reached the edge of the known evidence and found nothing beyond it. Roha's notebook entry from August 1944, confirming the room's survival after the first bombing raids, and the Soviet investigator's notebook from late 1945, recording answers that led nowhere, bracket a period of roughly 14 months that the historical record has not been able to illuminate in any way that resolves the question. Between those two notebooks, one belonging to the last man who saw the room intact, one belonging to the first investigator who tried to find out where it went, is everything that remains unknown, and it has remained unknown for 80 years, the tween spits of bald burst men, and nothing that has been done in those 80 years has narrowed the gap in any verifiable direction. The Trophy Brigade's report, with its blank field where the room's location should have been entered, was filed in April 1945 and sent up the chain of Soviet military authority toward the cultural institutions that had been waiting for news of the room since the German occupation began in 1941. The news the report delivered was the worst kind of administrative news, not a confirmed destruction, not a confirmed evacuation, not a transfer that could be traced, but simply an absence. The room was not there. No explanation was offered because no explanation was available. The investigation would continue. It has continued. The Amber Display Hall in Königsberg Castle in the autumn of 1944 held the panels for a moment that now appears, from the distance of 8 decades, to have been a kind of provisional pause. The room surviving the bombing raids, the war still in its final phase, the fate of the city and everything in it still technically undetermined. Rhoda stood in the hall that August morning and made his notes, and was, for that moment, the custodian of something that had survived 200 years and 2,000 miles and was still intact. The mornings that followed that one, through the autumn and into the winter, through the Soviet advance and the evacuations and the chaos of the final weeks, are the mornings the record cannot account for. What Rhoda saw in those mornings, what happened to the room he had spent 3 years documenting and displaying and writing about, that knowledge, if it existed in any recoverable form, died with him in December 1945, in a damaged city, in the ruins of a war, while a Soviet investigator's notebook waited in a drawer somewhere with its incomplete record of conversations that would not be continued. The pale rectangular shadows on the plaster of the empty hall, the outlines of what had been pressed against those walls for 3 years and was no longer there, faded as the years passed and the castle itself fell into worse disrepair before it was eventually demolished. They were visible long enough for the trophy brigade to note them, long enough for the first investigators to understand precisely what shape the absence had taken. Then the walls that held them were gone, and the ground that held the walls was excavated and re-excavated, and the amber that had once glowed in that hall was somewhere, in the earth beneath the city, or in the Baltic Sea, or in the ash layer beneath what is now a parking structure, or a government building, or a road, and the question of exactly where has remained, through all the investigations and all the excavations and all the reviewed archives, exactly as open as it was on the morning in April 1945 when the Trophy Brigade found the room gone and wrote on their standard military form the only honest thing that could be written, that it was not there, and that its location was unknown, and that the investigation was ongoing, and that more information would follow when it was available. The information did not follow. The field remained blank. The walls had their shadows, and then they did not. The question settled into the ground alongside everything else the war buried there, quiet and undisturbed, still waiting for an answer that the record so far has not found a way to provide. A thick bound document sits on a researcher's desk in a quiet archive room, its cover marked with the institutional seals of both German and Russian cultural authorities, its spine creased from repeated opening, its pages flagged at intervals with small colored tabs that mark the passages its reviewers return to most often. The document is the final report of a joint German-Russian scholarly commission completed in 2004 after years of coordinated archival work across collections in Russia, Germany, Britain, and Poland. It runs to several hundred pages, and its central conclusion, the one the colored tabs cluster around, the one that appears on the page most heavily annotated, states that the most probable fate of the Amber Room was destruction by fire, either during the RAF bombing raids of August 1944 or during the final Soviet assault on Königsberg in April 1945. The conclusion is framed with care. The words chosen are deliberate. The Commission writes that the evidence is entirely circumstantial and that the question cannot be definitively closed. Both of those things appear in the same sentence. The document manages, with the measured precision of formal scholarship, To say at once that the most likely answer is destruction, and that this answer rests on no direct evidence and may be wrong, that is where the official record comes to rest, not at a solution, not at a confirmed location, or a verified inventory, or a set of authenticated components recovered from a known site. The record rests after 60 years of investigation and thousands of reviewed documents and multiple government-sponsored searches at a conclusion that is careful enough to contain its own uncertainty within its own wording. This is not a failure of the Commission. It is an accurate account of the state of the evidence. The evidence permits a conclusion about probability. It does not permit a conclusion about fact. Those two things are different, and the Commission did not collapse the difference, and the document it produced is honest in exactly the proportion that honesty requires. The Commission's report did not stop the theories. It was never going to stop the theories. The theories had been running since April 1945, since the moment Soviet Trophy Brigade investigators walked into the empty amber display hall in Königsberg Castle and found bare plaster walls and a debris-strewn floor, and no trace of the 27 crates that had been logged into the castle's inventory in late 1941. The theories had been running through the late 1940s and the 1950s and the Cold War decades, accumulating detail and variation and cross-referencing witness accounts that sometimes confirmed one another and sometimes directly contradicted one another. And they had been running long enough by 2004 that the Commission's careful conclusion could not dissolve them. The absence of proof of destruction is not proof of survival, but it is also not proof of destruction. And in that gap, that specific documented, carefully preserved gap, the theories continued to live. The most widely discussed alternative to the destruction conclusion involves the Baltic Sea routes. Between January and April 1945, as Soviet forces pushed westward through East Prussia, and the land routes out of Königsberg narrowed and eventually closed, the German military and civilian administration conducted a large-scale evacuation of personnel and material by sea across the Baltic. This is documented. Ships made multiple crossings, personnel were moved, equipment was moved, certain categories of valuables were moved. The question that the evacuation theory asks is whether the Amber Room's 27 crates were among the materials loaded onto Baltic vessels during those months. The documents that would confirm or deny this, a manifest, a loading record, a transport order with an inventory reference, have never been produced in authenticated form. The sea route existed, the crates existed, or had existed. Whether the two things connected remains unverified. Within the evacuation theory, several specific variants have been proposed and investigated over the decades. One holds that the crates were placed aboard one of the large vessels lost during the evacuation, ships sunk by Soviet submarine or aerial attack in the Baltic in early 1945, their cargo still on the seabed. Another variant places the crates in inland Germany, in the extensive network of bunkers and concealed storage sites in Thuringia that the Nazi regime used for cultural valuables and strategic reserves in the war's final months, a network that did yield, after the war, significant quantities of looted art and gold, though nothing verifiably from the Amber Room. A third variant imagines the crates still somewhere beneath the former city of Königsberg, in sections of the wartime tunnel and basement system that the post-war Soviet and later Russian excavations never fully mapped. None of these variants has been confirmed. Each rests on partial testimony, plausible logistics, and the same fundamental absence, the missing transport record, that leaves the Commission's destruction conclusion in place as the most probable answer, while denying it the status of fact. The excavations beneath Königsberg are worth dwelling on. The city was captured in April 1945, renamed Kaliningrad, and absorbed into Soviet territory, which meant that the investigation of what it might contain proceeded under Soviet and then Russian authority for decades, largely invisible to Western researchers. Soviet trophy brigades began their work in 1945. Formal excavations were conducted in the 1960s, and again in the 1980s. These were serious operations. Concrete reinforced tunnels probed with work lights, basement systems mapped against wartime architectural records, earth removed from chambers sealed since 1945. The excavations recovered other things, other looted artworks, other concealed materials from the war's final chaos. The region had served as a transit and storage point for significant quantities of material during the German occupation, and the ground beneath it held correspondingly significant quantities of what had been buried or forgotten there. The amber panels, if they had been there, would have been findable. They were not found. A single excavation site from the 1980s exists in documentary records with enough specificity to carry an image. Somewhere beneath the former footprint of Königsberg Castle, now a cleared area in central Kaliningrad, the castle itself having been demolished in stages after the war. Investigators entered a low concrete passage, moving carefully through a space that had been undisturbed since the mid-1940s. The work lights ran on a cable fed back to a generator at the tunnel entrance. The walls were damp, the floor was uneven. The passage led to a sealed chamber that showed signs of wartime construction, concrete poured hastily, the marks of hand tools still visible in the cured surface. The chamber was opened. It contained, according to the available record, materials that were cataloged and removed for analysis. The amber panels were not among them. The investigators moved on to the next section of the tunnel system, and the next sealed chamber, and the amber room was not in any of them. The question that the excavations could not answer, and that no excavation conducted to date has been able to answer, is whether the tunnel system they mapped was complete. Königsberg was a medieval city built on layers of its own history, its subsurface a palimpsest of construction from different centuries, and the wartime modifications added to that existing complexity rather than replacing it. The documented tunnel network was the network that showed up in the architectural records the investigators had access to. The possibility of undocumented passages, of sealed chambers not connected to the map system, of sections of the wartime infrastructure that were never officially recorded because they were built in the final desperate months of a collapsing administration, that possibility has never been eliminated. It cannot be eliminated. The ground is large, and the records of what was built beneath it are incomplete, and the Commission's 2004 conclusion says most probably destroyed, which leaves the probability, small and unclaimed, that it was not. George Stein spent decades trying to resolve that probability. He had served as a German soldier during the war, and in the years afterward he became, by gradual degrees, the most persistent private investigator of the Amber Room's fate in either East or West Germany. He compiled files over many years, folders of witness testimonies gathered from veterans and former civilian administrators of East Prussia, photocopied documents from archives that were difficult to access, interview transcripts conducted in German and Russian with people who had been in Königsberg during the final months and were willing to speak. His files grew into an archive that was consulted by both Soviet investigators and West German cultural authorities. He followed leads that official investigations had not followed, or had followed and then dropped. He maintained correspondence with researchers and journalists, on both sides of the Cold War divide. He was, by the accounts of those who knew his work, methodical and serious, not a sensationalist, not a conspiracy theorist in the dismissive sense, but someone who had given his adult life to a question that the official record had not answered, and who believed, from the materials he had assembled, that the question had an answer, and that the answer was findable. In 1987, George Stein was found dead in a Bavarian forest. The death was attributed to stabbing. The official ruling was suicide. The most sensitive portions of his research files were missing from his archive when investigators reviewed it after his death. His colleagues and the journalists who subsequently investigated his case have described the official ruling as deeply implausible, noting that the circumstances of both the death and the missing files are difficult to reconcile with a straightforward self-inflicted cause. What the record does not provide is a documented alternative, an identified perpetrator, an authenticated account of who took the files or why, a verified connection between the contents of the missing portions of his archive and any party who might have had reason to prevent their disclosure. The suspicious elements of the case are real and documented. The explanation for those elements has never been established. What is known is that George Stein is dead, that portions of his life's research are gone, and that the question he spent his adult life investigating remains more than 3 decades after his death, exactly where he left it. The missing files have never been reconstructed in complete form. What survived of Stein's archive, the portions not removed, was reviewed by later researchers and journalists who found it substantial but incomplete, its most significant leads terminating at exactly the points where the missing materials would have continued them. Whether those leads pointed toward a genuine discovery or toward another dead end has no answer. The archive, as it now exists, ends mid-thread, its conclusions unavailable, its most sensitive sections gone from a folder of folders in a Bavarian study, and the amber room still not located. Soviet investigators had their own encounters with the limits of the record. The brief questioning of Alfred Roda in late 1945, conducted before his death in December of that year, produced notes that survived, a few pages of cramped handwriting recording answers that the investigator found unsatisfactory, and questions that Roda deflected or claimed not to be able to answer. Roda had been the room's custodian in Königsberg from 1941 to 1944. He had logged the crates into the castle inventory. He had overseen the reinstallation of the panels. He had published scholarly articles during those years, arguing that the room and the city belonged together. If anyone in the German administrative structure knew what had happened to the crates in early 1945, it was Roda. The investigator's notes record answers that led nowhere. Roda claimed no knowledge of where the room had gone. He died of typhus, along with his wife, within weeks of the interview. The notes went into a file that was classified and remained inaccessible for decades. When researchers eventually reached them, they found a record of an interview that had ended too soon, with an interviewee who was dead before the questioning could resume, and a set of questions that were never followed up because the man who might have answered them was no longer there to ask. The Florentine mosaic panels are worth a separate moment of attention. The 4 pictorial insets that had been set into the amber walls, rectangular works in gray-green and rust-colored stone depicting allegorical figures, their cooler palette, making the amber around them appear to burn more intensely, were not among the components recovered in any of the post-war excavations or searches. This is significant in a specific way. The mosaic panels were durable in a way that amber itself was not. Amber is organic, brittle, sensitive to fire and moisture, and fluctuating temperature. The Florentine stone mosaics were more resilient, less vulnerable to the specific agents, fire, water, physical shock, that would most readily account for the amber's destruction. If the amber panels had been destroyed in the fires of 1944 or 1945, while the stone mosaics had survived, the mosaics might have entered the post-war art market, been looted by individual soldiers, surfaced somewhere in the decades of provenance research that followed the war. None of the 4 panels has been authenticated and located. Their silence is as complete as the silence of the amber itself, which is consistent with simultaneous destruction and equally consistent with simultaneous survival in a single undiscovered location. One authenticated panel did surface in a manner that briefly suggested a possible thread. In the 1990s, a single decorative element, a small amber mosaic chest that had formed part of the room's furnishings rather than its fixed panels, was identified in Germany and returned to Russia. It had been in private possession since the end of the war, its wartime provenance documented through family records. The recovery was significant as a matter of cultural restitution. As evidence of the room's broader fate, it was ambiguous at best. The chest had traveled separately from the main crates, through private channels rather than official military transport, which placed it outside the logistical chain that governed the 27 crates and could not illuminate what had happened to them. The thread it offered was real but short. It ended almost where it began. The reconstruction that now stands in the Catherine Palace at Tsarskoye Selo took nearly 25 years to complete. Work began in the late 1970s under Soviet cultural authorities who recognized that the original room was unlikely to be recovered and that the space it had occupied deserved to be filled again. The craftsmen assigned to the project had to learn techniques that had largely disappeared from practice since the 18th century, amber working skills that existed in the historical record but not in living tradition, and the early years of the reconstruction were as much an act of craft recovery as of physical rebuilding. Amber was sourced from the same Baltic deposits that had supplied the original room, the Samland Peninsula coast, now part of Kaliningrad territory, still yielding the stones in the same range of colors, from pale yellow to deep cognac, that Gottfried Wolfram had worked with nearly 3 centuries before. Approximately 6 tons of amber went into the reconstruction, matching the estimated quantity used in the original. The German energy company Rugas AG contributed significant funding to the project in the 1990s, an act framed explicitly as bilateral reconciliation, a German institution contributing to the restoration of something that German forces had removed from a Russian palace. The gesture was accepted and acknowledged in those terms by the Russian cultural authorities overseeing the reconstruction. The completed room was opened on May 31st, 2003, at a formal ceremony attended by Russian President Vladimir Putin and German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder. The 2 leaders stood in a room that had taken 2.5 decades to rebuild, in a palace that had spent the intervening years without it, and the photographs from the ceremony show the amber walls glowing behind them in the specific warm gold that 18th century visitors had struggled to find adequate words for. The reconstructed room draws millions of visitors each year. They stand in the doorway and look at amber walls rising in 3 tiers from the parquet floor to the gilded cornice, the Florentine mosaic insets in their correct positions, the mirrored pilasters reflecting the candlelight or the electric light that stands in for it now, back and forth until the room appears to extend inward in every direction into amber distance. The guides explain that the room was stolen in 1941 and never recovered, and that what visitors are seeing is a faithful reconstruction based on pre-war photographs and surviving documentation. The visitors look at the walls. The walls glow. The question of whether the original room still exists somewhere, in some form, goes on existing quietly alongside the reconstruction, neither confirmed nor finally closed. The archive and the amber and the sealed chamber and the missing files and the commission's careful conclusion, all continuing in parallel with the millions of pairs of eyes that have stood in the doorway and looked at what 21st century craftsmen built from Baltic stone and decades of recovered technique. The pre-war photographs that guided the reconstruction are themselves a particular kind of document. They show the room as it appeared in the early 20th century, black and white images that nevertheless convey the room's essential character through the texture of the amber surfaces, the arrangement of the decorative tiers, the precise positions of the Florentine insets. The photographs were taken before the war, before the looting, before the question of the room's location became a question at all, when it was simply a room in a palace, and photographs of it were a matter of cultural documentation rather than forensic record. They became forensic record afterward. They became the evidence from which an entire room had to be deduced and rebuilt, measurement by measurement. The craftsman working from fixed points in the image geometry to reconstruct dimensions that no longer existed anywhere but in the photographs and in the archival drawings that supplemented them. There is something particular about the texture of that process, about a room being rebuilt from its own photograph, the image that survived being used to reconstruct the object, the image recorded. The photograph is not the room, the reconstruction is not the original, and the original is, most probably, according to the best available scholarly assessment, gone, but most probably is not certainly, and the sealed chambers under Kaliningrad are still sealed, and the missing sections of George Stein's archive have not been found, and the 27 crates that were logged into Königsberg Castle's inventory in late 1941 have not been produced in any form, destroyed or intact, and the Commission's conclusion remains exactly what it was when it was written, a determination made from absence, honest about its own limits, holding the question open in the only responsible way a serious institution can hold a question that the evidence does not close. The Kaliningrad of today is a Russian exclave on the Baltic coast, separated from the Russian mainland by Lithuania and Belarus, a city of roughly 500,000 people that sits on the physical ground of the former Königsberg. The medieval and Baroque architecture of the old city is largely gone, bombed in 1944, destroyed in the urban battle of 1945, demolished in stages during the Soviet period, replaced by the functional concrete of post-war reconstruction. The castle footprint is a cleared area. The amber display hall where Rhoda reinstalled the panels in 1941 exists as a location reference in archival documents, but not as a standing room in a standing building. The city that grew over the ruins of Königsberg built its streets and apartment blocks and municipal buildings over the layers of wartime rubble and wartime concealment that lay beneath, and the ground beneath those streets has been only partially investigated, its full contents still unknown. A tunnel beneath a Kaliningrad street on a winter afternoon, a work light on an extension cord, damp concrete walls, a sealed chamber not yet reached. The investigators who are not there today, who have not been there in years, who may return or may not, depending on funding and political circumstance, and the slow administrative rhythm of a cultural recovery operation that has been running at intervals for 80 years without reaching the thing it was looking for. The amber inside the chamber, if there is a chamber, if the chamber contains amber, if the amber survived the 80 years between its sealing and its hypothetical opening, would be dark in there. Amber does not generate its own light. It only transmits and intensifies the light that reaches it, and in the sealed dark it would simply be stones in wooden crates, their colors invisible, their extraordinary origin in 44-million-year-old resin, irrelevant to anything except the fact of their presence or absence, which is the only fact the question has ever been asking. The Commission's report sits in its archive. The colored tabs mark the same passages they always did. The conclusion is there on the flagged page, its careful hedging still intact, its most probable and its cannot be definitively closed, still sharing the same sentence, like two things that will never be separated from each other by the evidence available. The report is a serious document produced by serious people working from the fullest collection of relevant archival material ever assembled for this specific purpose. It says what it says, and what it says is not nothing, and what it says is not everything, and the gap between those two things is exactly the shape of the amber room's absence, the outline on the wall where the panels were, the rectangular pale shadows on the Königsberg castle, plaster that the Soviet trophy brigades photographed in May 1945, the inventory entry in Rhoda's careful hand that records the crates arriving and has no corresponding entry recording them leaving. The room at the Catherine Palace glows every day now. The craftsmen who built it worked from the same Baltic coast amber that their 18th century predecessors used. The same range of colors, pale yellow, honey, deep cognac, the occasional rare piece in near transparent blue-green. The foil backing behind each piece catches the light in the same way, amplifying what comes through the amber and returning it into the room. The mirrored pilasters do what they have always done, which is to take the light at one point on the wall and send it back and forward and sideways until the room appears to be larger than its physical dimensions, the glow extending past the actual walls into a space that exists only in the reflections. Visitors stand in the doorway. The guides explain. The amber glows. The question of what the original room is now, ash in the rubble of a bombed castle, stones in the dark of a sealed chamber, artifacts dispersed into private collections in the decades of post-war chaos, something else entirely, goes on being the question. It has been the question since April 1945. It was the question when the Soviet trophy brigades wrote their first investigative report in the ruins of Königsberg. It was the question when Alfred Rohde died in December 1945 without having answered it. It was the question when George Stein assembled his archive over decades and then died in a Bavarian forest in 1987 with the most sensitive sections of his files gone. It was the question when the Joint Commission reviewed thousands of archival pages and wrote their 2004 report with its careful, honest conclusion. It is the question now, in the sealed and unmapped portions of the Kaliningrad subsurface, in the absence of an authenticated transport record, in the gap between the last reliable documentation of the room's intact survival in January 1945 and the empty display hall that the Soviet investigators found in April of the same year. The world that contains this question goes on in the usual way. The Catherine Palace is open on most days of the year. The reconstructed room receives its visitors and its light.